My name is Rose Atkinson. I'm 35 years old, and 3 weeks ago I sat outside a courtroom holding a flash drive in my coat pocket while my own mother celebrated behind a closed door 20 feet away, certain that she had finally won. She had no idea that the woman she'd spent her whole life underestimating was the reason two detectives were about to walk through that door and ask her to come with them. Before I tell you how I ended up sitting on that hallway bench, with my hands steady and my heart calm for the first time in months, I need to take you back to a kitchen table in Millbrook, Ohio, and a grandmother who saw me exactly 1 week before anyone else in my family bothered to look my way at all. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally get to close the account. If you've ever been the one who fixes everything and gets remembered for nothing, this one is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if it resonates, hit subscribe, because the ending of this story took even me by surprise. I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my working life untangling other people's lies, the ones hidden in spreadsheets and shell companies, and numbers that were rounded just a little too conveniently. I got into the field almost by accident, but looking back now, I think some part of me had been training for it since I was about 9 years old, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table in Millbrook, watching her balance her checkbook by hand while she waited for my mother to remember to pick me up. That's not a metaphor. That's just what happened most weekends of my childhood. My parents, Diane and Frank Atkinson, ran a modest hardware supply business out of a storefront on Route 9, and by every account they were decent, hard-working people. They were also, without ever quite saying it out loud, a family that had already decided which of their 2 daughters was worth investing in. My younger sister Kayla was born 3 years after me, and from the moment she arrived, something in our house rearranged itself around her. She was the pretty one, the charming one, the one who could walk into a room and have every adult smiling before she'd said a word. I was the practical one, which in our family was a polite way of saying the forgettable one. I did well in school without anyone noticing. I never got in trouble, never needed to be picked up from a party, never gave my parents a single sleepless night, and somewhere along the way, that became its own kind of invisibility. Being easy meant being overlooked. I understood the arithmetic of my childhood a lot earlier than most kids do, because arithmetic was the only language in that house that ever told me the truth. There was one person who never made me feel like a rounding error, and that was my grandmother, Vivian Hargrove, my mother's mother. Vivian lived alone in a narrow 2-story house on Cedar Lane, with a porch swing that creaked in a rhythm I could still hum for you today. Every Sunday from the time I was 7 until I left for college, I took the bus across town and spent the afternoon with her, while my parents ran the store, and Kayla went to whatever lesson or recital was on the calendar that week. Vivian taught me to bake bread from scratch and to read a bank statement line by line, and she never once treated those 2 skills as though one mattered more than the other. She had been a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing plant for almost 30 years before she retired, and she used to say that numbers were the only thing in this world that never learned how to lie on their own. People made numbers lie, she'd tell me, tapping her pencil against the ledger paper. The numbers themselves are always honest. You just have to know how to listen to them. I loved her in a way that felt almost embarrassing to admit, because it was so much bigger than the love I felt for my own parents, and for a long time I carried a quiet guilt about that. It wasn't until I was much older that I understood the guilt belonged somewhere else entirely. Vivian was the only adult in my life who ever asked me what I thought about something, and then actually waited to hear the answer. She kept every report card I ever brought her, even the years my mother didn't ask to see them. She noticed when I got a science award in 7th grade that nobody else in my family showed up for, and she drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to sit in the 3rd row of an auditorium that was otherwise nearly empty. Afterwards, she took me to a diner and ordered me a slice of pie I hadn't asked for, and told me, plain and matter-of-fact, that she was proud of me, and that pride wasn't something you had to earn by being loud. I was 13 years old, and I still remember the exact booth we sat in. By the time I was in my 20s, working my way through my accounting certification while waiting tables to cover rent. My relationship with my parents had settled into something polite and distant. Kayla, meanwhile, had become the center of gravity for the whole family, in a way that felt less like affection and more like an investment strategy. There was a car for her 16th birthday that I never got at any age. There was a fund my parents had quietly built for her wedding before she was even engaged, money that came, I would later learn, from more places than just my parents' own pockets. When I asked once, gently, half joking, whether there was a similar fund for me, my mother laughed in a way that wasn't unkind exactly, just final. She said Kayla needed more support finding her footing, and that I had always been the one who could take care of myself. I told myself that was a compliment for years. It took me a long time to understand it was actually a sentence, and that sentence had been quietly deciding who mattered in that family since before I could talk. Vivian was the exception to all of it, and as she got older, she became more than an exception. She became the only proof I had that I wasn't imagining the difference in how I was treated. In her last few years, after a couple of small health scares, she started saying things to me that I filed away without fully understanding at the time. One Sunday, not long after her 79th birthday, she set down her tea and looked at me with an expression I'd never quite seen on her before, something steadier and more deliberate than her usual warmth. She told me she had been watching this family for a very long time, longer than I probably realized, and that she had learned something about people that most folks never let themselves learn about their own children. Some people, she said, only love you as much as they can use you. I remember laughing nervously and asking her what that meant. She just patted my hand and told me not to worry about it yet, that she was taking care of a few things, and that when the time came, I would understand exactly what she'd meant, and exactly why she'd waited so long to say it out loud. I didn't ask her to explain further. I wish now, more than almost anything, that I had. I want to tell you about a specific afternoon, because I think it explains the shape of my entire childhood better than any general description ever could. I was 11 years old, and I had spent 3 months building a model of the water cycle for the regional science fair, the kind of project where you actually construct a working miniature ecosystem inside a sealed container and chart the condensation over several weeks. I did it entirely on my own, mostly at Vivian's kitchen table, because our house on weeknights was usually full of noise from Kayla's dance rehearsals or the endless parade of tutors my parents brought in for her. My project won first place in the county, which meant a small trophy and a mention in the local paper, and it also meant a Saturday afternoon ceremony that my parents knew about weeks in advance because I had circled it on the calendar in the kitchen myself, in red marker, the way you do when you're 11 and you still believe circling something in red will make people show up. That same Saturday, Kayla had a dance recital. Not a competition, not a scholarship audition, just the regular end-of-season recital that happened every single year at the same community center. My parents chose the recital. I found out they weren't coming to my ceremony about 20 minutes before it started, when my mother called the school office to say she'd drop me off but couldn't stay because they needed to get across town for Kayla. I stood at the podium later that day and accepted my trophy in front of a half-empty auditorium, and the only familiar face in the crowd was Vivian's, sitting exactly where she always sat, third row, aisle seat, clapping louder than anyone else in the room combined. She took me for pie afterwards, the same diner, the same booth, and she never once said a bad word about my parents. She just let me talk, and when I was done talking, she told me that some children get chosen for what they can become, and other children get chosen simply because they exist, and that the second kind of choosing was rarer and more valuable than anyone in that family understood yet. That pattern repeated itself so many times over the years that I eventually stopped keeping count, though somewhere in the back of my mind, the accountant I would eventually become was quietly keeping the ledger anyway. There was the year my parents paid for Kayla to attend an expensive summer arts intensive in another state, $3,000 they described as an investment in her future. The same year I asked if I could take a discounted community college course over the summer to get ahead on my accounting prerequisites, and was told the family budget was tight right now. There was my 16th birthday, which came and went with a card and a $20 bill tucked inside it, followed 18 months later by Kayla's 16th birthday, which came with a used but perfectly reliable sedan sitting in the driveway with a bow on it, because my parents wanted her to feel safe and independent as she started driving to her activities. I never once heard anyone acknowledge that I had been driving myself to and from work at a diner for over a year by that point in a car I bought with my own tip money. I don't tell you any of this because I want you to feel sorry for me. I tell you this because I need you to understand exactly how quietly this kind of thing operates inside a family, how it never announces itself as cruelty, how it always comes dressed up as practicality or fairness or simply the way things worked out this time. Nobody in my family ever sat me down and said, "Rose, we love your sister more." They didn't have to. The math did the talking for them, year after year, and I was the one person in the house trained from childhood to read math correctly. I understood the numbers even when I couldn't yet say the sentence out loud, the sentence Vivian would eventually say for me. Some people only love you as much as they can use you, and I had apparently never been useful enough, or maybe I had been too useful in the wrong, quiet way, the kind that didn't require attention or investment, because I had already learned not to ask for either. Vivian's health began to decline more seriously the year I turned 32. It started small, a hip replacement that took longer to heal than it should have, a few instances of confusion that her doctor attributed to medication interactions, nothing that alarmed anyone too badly at first. I started driving out to Millbrook every other weekend instead of just holidays, partly because I wanted to be near her, and partly because I noticed my mother's visits had become oddly frequent for someone who had spent most of my childhood too busy to show up to things. At the time, I told myself that was a good sign, that maybe my mother was finally making more room in her life for her own mother, the way people sometimes do when mortality starts feeling closer than it used to. It would be a long while before I understood what those visits were actually about, and how far they had already progressed by the time I started paying closer attention. It was during one of those weekend visits, about a year and a half before she passed, that Vivian said something to me that I have replayed in my head more times than I can count since. We were sitting on her back porch, the swing creaking the way it always did, and she had a cup of tea going cold in her hands because she had stopped drinking it partway through, which by then had become one of the small, quiet signs that told me she was tired in a way that went deeper than the afternoon. She turned to me and asked, almost casually, whether I still remembered how to read a will. I laughed and told her that reading legal documents was more or less my entire job now, and she nodded like that answer satisfied something she'd been wondering about. Then she told me she had been working with a lawyer, not the family lawyer that my parents used for the store, but someone of her own, someone in the next county over that nobody else in the family knew about. She said she had been putting some things in order, and that she wanted me, specifically me, to know that whatever happened, whatever anyone in this family ever tried to tell me about what she wanted, I should trust what I already knew to be true about her, because she had made certain that the truth would be findable, even if it weren't easy to find. I asked her directly what she meant by that, and for a moment I thought she might actually tell me. Her face did something I hadn't seen before, a kind of tired resolve, the look of someone who has already decided a difficult thing and is simply waiting for the right moment to let it unfold instead of forcing it early. She reached over and took my hand, the same way she used to when I was small and upset about something at school, and she told me that she loved all of her family, that this wasn't about love in the way people usually meant it. It was about something she called stewardship, a word she used carefully, like she'd chosen it on purpose instead of a softer one. She said she had watched this family for over 3 decades, watched who showed up and who didn't, watched who asked for things and who simply gave, without ever expecting to receive anything back, and that she had decided a long time ago that stewardship should go to the person who understood what it actually meant to take care of something instead of simply taking from it. Then she squeezed my hand once, told me not to worry about any of it yet, and asked me to help her back inside because the evening had gotten cooler than she expected. I didn't push her further that night. I have thought about that decision more than almost any other decision of my adult life, because I didn't know then that the window to ask more questions was closing faster than either of us realized, and that within 18 months, the answers to everything she had almost told me would arrive in the worst possible way, in a lawyer's office full of people who had never once, in their entire lives, learned to read a number honestly. Vivian passed away on a Tuesday morning in early October, quietly, in her sleep, in the same house on Cedar Lane where she had lived for almost 50 years. The call came from the home health aide who had been checking on her 3 mornings a week for the last few months, a kind woman named Renata who cried harder on the phone than I did in that first moment, because I think some part of me had gone very still and very practical the second I heard the tone in her voice, before she'd even said the words. I drove out to Millbrook that same afternoon, and I sat in Vivian's kitchen for almost 2 hours before anyone else in the family arrived, just sitting at that same table where she'd taught me to balance a checkbook when I was 9 years old, and I let myself cry, the kind of crying I hadn't done since I was a child, the kind that comes from somewhere underneath the part of you that usually stays composed for other people. The funeral itself was small, exactly the way Vivian would have wanted it. She had never cared much for spectacle, and she'd left specific instructions with the funeral home years earlier about keeping things simple, a plain service at the little Methodist church she'd attended for decades, no elaborate flowers, just a request that everyone who came bring a dish for the reception afterward instead, because she had always believed a shared meal said more than an expensive wreath ever could. I organized most of it myself, the way I organize everything, quietly and without being asked, because that has always been my role in this family, and grief did not change that particular arrangement. My mother cried beautifully at the service, the kind of composed, photogenic grief that draws sympathetic hands to your shoulder, and Kayla stood beside her in a black dress that had clearly been bought for the occasion, and I stood a few feet away doing the math on the guest book and the reception table, and whether we had enough coffee, because somebody had to, and it was never going to be either of them. The will reading happened 11 days later, on a Friday afternoon in the office of a lawyer named Wade Pruitt, a family friend my parents had used for years for the hardware store's business filings, a heavy-set man in his 60s with a habit of clearing his throat before he said anything he seemed uncertain about. I remember that detail specifically because he cleared his throat 4 times before he even opened the folder in front of him, and even then, sitting in that stiff leather chair with no idea yet what was coming, some old professional instinct in me clocked it and filed it away without my even meaning to. My parents sat closest to the desk. Kayla sat beside them with her husband, a man named Dennis who had married into the family 2 years earlier and who I had always found pleasant enough in a way that never asked too much of me. I sat a little further back, near the window, the way I had always sat at every family gathering for as long as I could remember, close enough to be present, far enough to not quite be part of the center of things. Wade cleared his throat a 5th time and began reading, and within the first few minutes, I understood that something about the document in front of him did not match the woman I had known my entire life. The house on Cedar Lane, along with the bulk of Vivian's modest but meaningful savings, was left entirely to my mother, described in the document as the daughter who had cared for her devotedly in her final years. There was a smaller sum designated for Kayla, described as a gift toward her growing family, since Kayla and Dennis had recently announced they were expecting their first child. And then there was a single line about me, so brief I actually asked Wade to read it again, because I thought I had misheard him the first time. It said only that any remaining personal items, not otherwise specified, could be divided among the family as they saw fit, with no further mention of my name attached to anything of substance at all. I sat very still while the room absorbed that information, and I watched my mother's face carefully, the way I have trained myself to watch faces for a living, looking for the flicker that tells you whether someone is surprised by news or simply performing surprise for an audience. What I saw was neither. What I saw was relief, Quick and small and gone almost as soon as it arrived, the kind of relief you feel when something you were nervous about turns out exactly the way you had planned it to. Kayla reached over and squeezed my mother's hand, and my mother said, in a voice that was gentle in exactly the wrong way, that she was sure Grandma had her reasons, and that family always finds a way to take care of each other, regardless of what's written on paper. Dennis, beside her, added that it was probably for the best that the house stay with someone who had actually been present at the end, and I remember turning to look at him and thinking, with a strange clinical distance that surprised even me, that he had used the word present the way you use a word you've rehearsed. I didn't argue in that office. I want to be honest with you about that, because I know some people watching this would have stood up right then and demanded answers, and there is a part of me that wonders now whether I should have. But I have spent my entire career learning that the worst thing you can do when something doesn't add up is react before you understand exactly what you're reacting to. So I sat quietly, and I thanked Wade for his time, and I drove home to my apartment that evening, and sat at my own kitchen table, with a legal pad in front of me, the same way I do when I'm working a difficult audit for a client, and I wrote down everything that felt wrong about that afternoon, one line at a time. The date on the document, which Wade had mentioned almost in passing, placed the will's execution just under 3 months before Vivian passed, well into the period when her cognitive episodes had become more frequent, according to the same home health notes I had personally seen during my visits. The language, which didn't sound like Vivian at all, phrases like devotedly cared for that felt lifted from a greeting card, rather than the plain, direct woman who had raised me on Sunday afternoons. And most of all, the conversation on that back porch, 18 months earlier, her hand in mine, her voice steady and deliberate, telling me that whatever anyone in this family ever tried to tell me about what she wanted, I should trust what I already knew to be true, because she had made certain the truth would be findable, even if it wasn't easy to find. I sat with that legal pad until nearly midnight, and somewhere in that quiet apartment, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a Friday night in an unremarkable building, something in me that had spent 35 years staying easy, staying quiet, staying the daughter who could take care of herself, finally stopped accepting the numbers I'd been handed at face value. I thought about Vivian's voice on that porch, patient and certain, and I thought about the word she had used, stewardship, chosen carefully instead of a softer one, and I understood, in the particular way that only makes sense to someone who has spent her whole career listening to what numbers actually say, instead of what people want them to say, that this document I had just watched Wade Pruitt read aloud was not the last honest word my grandmother had left behind. It was simply the first lie someone had told about her, and I intended, quietly and without announcing a single thing to anyone in that family, to find out exactly who had told it. I started the way I start every case that lands on my desk at work, by building a timeline first and letting my opinions come second. The morning after the will reading, before I had even showered or made coffee, I pulled up the digital folder where I kept scanned copies of everything related to Vivian's care over the last 2 years, medical summaries Renata had shared with me as her health aide, notes from the few doctor's appointments I had personally driven her to, and the small handwritten calendar Vivian herself had kept on her kitchen wall, which I had taken home with me from the house without really thinking about why, the way you sometimes take small objects after a death, simply because your hands need something to hold on to. Laid out end to end, that timeline told a very different story than the one Wade Pruitt had read aloud in his office. The will was dated the second week of July, which according to Renata's notes and Vivian's own doctor, fell directly in the middle of what her physician had described in writing as a period of significant cognitive fluctuation, brought on by a medication adjustment that had left her confused and disoriented on and off for nearly 6 weeks. I remembered that stretch of time myself, because it was the same period when I had driven out to Millbrook on a Wednesday, an unusual day for me to visit, after Renata called to say Vivian had been asking for me by a name that wasn't mine and had seemed unsure, for almost a full hour that afternoon, about what year it was. I sat with that memory for a long time at my kitchen table, turning it over, because it did not match at all with the image of a woman who had, according to the document Wade read, sat down with full clarity and deliberately decided to leave her granddaughter nothing but whatever family members felt like handing over afterwards. I called Wade's office that same week, keeping my voice as neutral and professional as I could manage, and asked for a copy of the notarized will along with the contact information for the notary who had witnessed the signing. Wade, to his credit, didn't hesitate to send it over, though something in his tone on the phone struck me as slightly too quick to reassure me that everything had been handled properly, the kind of reassurance people offer when they suspect a question is coming and want to answer it before it's fully asked. When the document arrived by email that evening, I printed it out and laid it beside an older document I had, a simple, durable power of attorney Vivian had signed years earlier for a minor medical decision, one I happened to still have a copy of because I had been the one who helped her file it. I am not a handwriting expert, but I don't need to be one to notice when a signature doesn't sit the same way on the page. When the pressure and rhythm of a person's hand tells a different story than the shape of the letters alone. Vivian's true signature had a distinctive, slightly shaky loop on the capital V, a small tremor she'd developed in her right hand years before any of this began. The signature on the new will was smoother than that, careful in a way that looked almost practiced, the kind of signature you get when someone is either having an unusually good day or is not entirely the one holding the pen. The notary listed on the document was a woman named Renata Ospina, which stopped me cold when I first read it, because for one disorienting second I thought it might be my grandmother's home health aide, until I looked more closely and realized it was simply a different woman entirely, someone whose name I had never heard mentioned once in 2 years of near constant contact with Vivian's care. I searched the state notary registry that same night, the way you search a name when your professional instincts have already started running ahead of your emotions, and found a listing for her, a mobile notary service operating out of a strip mall office nearly 40 minutes from Cedar Lane, in a town Vivian, to my knowledge, had not visited in years, especially not during the period when she could barely manage a car ride to her own doctor's appointments without becoming disoriented. I drove to that strip mall office on a Saturday morning, telling no one in my family where I was going, and found a small storefront wedged between a nail salon and a check cashing business, the kind of place that exists to move paperwork through quickly for people who need something notarized fast and without too many questions. The woman at the desk, when I gave her my name and explained I had a question about a document she had witnessed, grew visibly uncomfortable almost immediately, and after a few careful questions about her record-keeping, she admitted, with the kind of nervous honesty of someone who suspects they might be in more trouble than they realized, that she could not actually locate her journal entry for that particular signing date, and that she vaguely remembered the appointment being arranged over the phone by someone who was not the person signing the document, someone who had told her the client had mobility issues and would be more comfortable meeting at a private residence rather than the office. When I asked whose residence that had been, she hesitated long enough that I already knew the answer before she said it out loud, and when she finally did say it, quietly, almost apologetically, it was my mother's address in Millbrook, not Vivian's house on Cedar Lane at all. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, some satisfying click of a puzzle piece falling perfectly into place, but what I actually felt sitting in my car in that strip mall parking lot afterwards was something much heavier and sadder than that, a kind of grief layered directly on top of the grief I was already carrying. Because what that notary had just told me, without fully understanding what she was confirming, was that at some point during the worst, most disoriented stretch of my grandmother's final months, someone had arranged for a document to be signed in a house that was not her own, with a witness who had never actually met her before that day, and that document had somehow become the official, legally recognized final word on everything Vivian Hargrove had spent her entire life building. I sat there for a long while before I finally started the car, and then, instead of driving home, I found myself turning toward Cedar Lane instead, toward the empty house that still smelled faintly of her, because I remembered something else she had told me on that porch, 18 months earlier, something I had filed away without fully understanding at the time. She had made certain the truth would be findable, even if it wasn't easy to find, and I had a growing, quiet certainty that whatever she had meant by that was still waiting for me somewhere inside that house, in a place none of the rest of my family had thought to look, because none of the rest of my family had ever bothered to learn how she actually kept things. The house on Cedar Lane still had a key under the loose brick beside the porch step, exactly where it had lived for as long as I could remember, and I let myself in that Saturday afternoon into a silence that felt heavier than any silence I had ever stood inside before. Nothing had been touched yet. My mother had mentioned once, briefly, that the family would need to go through Vivian's things eventually, sort what to keep and what to sell, get the house ready to list, but nobody had made a move to actually start that process, and some part of me was grateful for that delay, because it meant the house was still exactly as Vivian had left it, her reading glasses folded on the side table, her cardigan still hung over the back of the kitchen chair where she always sat. I sat down at that kitchen table, the same one where she had taught me to balance a checkbook at 9 years old, and I let myself simply be still for a while, before I started looking for anything. I thought about the way she used to talk about her ledgers, how she kept everything organized in categories that made sense to nobody but her, how she had once told me, half joking, that the safest place to hide something important was never in a lockbox, because lockboxes were the first place people looked. The safest place, she'd said, was somewhere so ordinary that nobody thought to search it at all. I got up and walked slowly through the kitchen, running my hand along the shelf above the stove where she kept her recipe box, an old tin container with a hinged lid that had belonged to her own mother, filled with index cards written in 3 generations of handwriting, and something about the weight of it in my hands when I lifted it down felt different than I remembered from childhood, heavier, more deliberate. Inside, beneath the cards for her pot roast and her Sunday bread, tucked flat against the bottom of the tin, I found a small brass key taped to an envelope with my name written across the front in her handwriting, the real one, the shaky loop on the R that I would have recognized anywhere. My hands were not steady when I opened it. Inside was a short note in her own words, telling me that if I was reading this, then something had happened the way she feared it might, and that the key belonged to a safety deposit box at a credit union in the next county over, the same institution where her private lawyer's office was located. A name and phone number written beneath it that I had never heard mentioned once in my entire life. She had written one more line at the bottom, underlined twice, the kind of emphasis she rarely used. It said, "Trust the numbers, Rose, not the people telling you what the numbers mean." I sat at that kitchen table and cried for the second time that week, not from grief this time, but from something closer to gratitude, the overwhelming, disorienting feeling of being seen by someone who was no longer there, to see the moment you finally understood exactly how thoroughly she had prepared for it. I didn't tell anyone in my family what I had found, not yet, because I had learned enough in 11 days to know that the moment I said anything out loud, the version of events my mother and sister had already settled into would start defending itself, and I needed time to understand the full picture before that happened. What I didn't fully appreciate yet was that while I had been quietly gathering pieces of the truth, my family had already begun moving forward on the assumption that the fraudulent will was simply how things were, and they were not moving slowly about it. Within 2 weeks of the reading, my mother had contacted a realtor about listing the Cedar Lane house, and Kayla, I later learned through an offhand comment from a cousin at a family gathering I nearly skipped, had already been talking with Dennis about using a portion of the inheritance toward a down payment on a larger home before the baby arrived, money that, according to the fraudulent document, wasn't technically hers to spend yet at all, since the estate hadn't even cleared probate. The moment that told me exactly how far they were willing to go came about 3 weeks after the reading, when my mother called me on a Sunday evening, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit, and asked if I would be willing to stop by the house that week to help sort through some of Vivian's paperwork before the estate sale, since I was, as she put it, always so good with that kind of thing. I said yes, because I wanted to see what exactly they were planning to do with whatever records were still sitting in that house, and when I arrived 2 days later, I found my mother and Dennis already there, a stack of folders spread across the dining room table, and among them, half tucked beneath a folder of old utility bills, a fresh document that had clearly been drafted recently, a power of attorney form with a blank signature line, and beside it a note in my mother's own handwriting listing out which of Vivian's remaining accounts still needed to be transferred, and a reminder to herself to call Wade about backdating a form if the bank asked questions about timing. I did not say a word about what I saw on that table. I simply thanked my mother for the coffee, told her I had another obligation I'd forgotten about, and left before either of them noticed how carefully I had photographed that page with my phone, while pretending to check a text message. Driving home that evening, I understood something with total clarity for the first time since the funeral. This was no longer a grieving family sorting through a complicated document in good faith. This was a family that had already decided the fraudulent will was simply a beginning, and that whatever paperwork still needed adjusting to make the story hold together, they were fully prepared to keep manufacturing it, one convenient form at a time, for as long as it took, and they were doing it in the same house where Vivian had spent 5 decades teaching me, without ever once knowing exactly how important that lesson would become, that numbers never lie, only the people writing them down do. The credit union in the next county was a small brick building with a single drive-through lane and a manager named Harold who had clearly known Vivian for years, the kind of familiarity you only find in towns where people still bank with the same institution their whole lives. When I showed him the key and my identification, along with a certified copy of my grandmother's death certificate, he walked me back to the vault himself, and I remember the particular quiet of that room, rows of small steel doors, the sound of my own breathing louder than it should have been, as he helped me lift out the long metal box and set it on the table in the private viewing room before stepping out to give me privacy. Inside, beneath a folded blanket that had once lived on the back of her reading chair, I found what my grandmother had spent the last 2 years of her life quietly assembling: a will, properly executed, and dated a full 8 months before the one Wade had read aloud, drawn up by an attorney named Priscilla Choi, whose name I recognized instantly from the note in the recipe tin. This document named me as primary beneficiary of the house, her remaining savings, and a smaller trust she had established years earlier that none of us had ever known existed, with a modest sum designated for Kayla's growing family, described not as a gift toward her future, but simply as an expression of love for her great-grandchild. Beneath the will sat a folder of bank statements Vivian had printed and highlighted herself in yellow marker, documenting a pattern of withdrawals from her checking account over the final year of her life, small at first, then larger, transfers that lined up almost exactly with the same weeks Renata's notes described as her most confused and vulnerable, each one initiated not by Vivian, but through an account she had apparently added my mother to as a joint signer during what the medical records would later confirm was a period of significant cognitive impairment. And at the very bottom, in an envelope sealed with her initials pressed into the wax the old-fashioned way, was a letter longer than the one I had found in the recipe tin, written in the same shaking hand, dated almost exactly a year before she passed. I sat alone in that small viewing room and read it twice through before I could make myself move. She wrote that she had started noticing, months earlier, small things that troubled her, papers appearing for her to sign that she didn't remember requesting, a sense some mornings of having agreed to something the night before that she couldn't fully recall, and that rather than confront anyone directly while she still wasn't certain what was happening, she had done the only thing she knew how to do with real confidence, which was keep her own honest record running alongside whatever record someone else was trying to build. She wrote that she loved my mother and loved Kayla, that this was never about punishing anyone, but that somewhere along the way she had watched fear and old resentments turn people she loved into people willing to take from someone too confused to stop them, and that she refused to let that be the last true thing written about her life. She wrote that she had chosen me, not because I had done anything to earn it in the way people usually mean that word, but because I was the only person in this family who had ever shown her, consistently, without being asked and without expecting anything back, that I understood the difference between what a person deserves and what a person can be talked into giving away. The last line of that letter is one I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She wrote, "You always knew how to read what was true, even when it was quiet, Rose. Now go make sure the truth gets to speak as loudly as it needs to." I called Priscilla Choi's office the following morning, and within an hour, I was sitting across from her at a small law practice tucked above a bakery, a sharp, unhurried woman in her 50s who listened to my entire account without interrupting once, and who confirmed, once I laid the timeline out for her, that she remembered Vivian well, remembered her coming in alone, lucid, deliberate, insistent on a formal capacity evaluation from her own physician before the will was even drafted, specifically because she told Priscilla she wanted no one to ever be able to say later that she hadn't known exactly what she was doing. Priscilla pulled her own file, and there it was. A signed capacity assessment dated the same week as the will, along with her original notarized signature. The real one, the shaky loop on the capital V unmistakable, next to the smoothed-over version Wade Pruitt had shown me weeks earlier. Priscilla explained what I already suspected but needed to hear from someone who could actually make it matter in a courtroom. That what I was looking at wasn't simply a family disagreement over an ambiguous document. It was very likely undue influence layered on top of outright forgery, and that the joint account transfers alone, made during a documented period of impaired capacity, constituted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under state law. A felony, not a family matter to be smoothed over at a future Thanksgiving. She told me the recording I had taken of the paperwork on my mother's dining room table, along with the notary's admission about the meeting location, would matter enormously, and she recommended I contact a detective she knew personally, a woman named Renee Castellano who specialized in elder financial abuse cases, and who, Priscilla said dryly, had seen almost this exact scenario play out in this county more times than either of us would probably find comfortable to hear. I left that office with a folder of certified copies and a phone number, and I sat in my car in the small lot behind the bakery for a long time before I finally drove home. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage, not yet, and it wasn't even really vindication. It was something quieter and steadier than either of those things, the particular calm that comes when a person who has spent their whole life being told the numbers didn't add up to much finally holds proof in their own hands that the numbers had been telling the truth about her all along. I thought about my mother's dining room table, the blank power of attorney form, the note about backdating paperwork, and I understood that whatever quiet grace period I had given my family without meaning to was over. They had spent 3 weeks assuming I had accepted the story they'd handed me. What they didn't know yet was that the entire time I had simply been doing the one thing this family had never once bothered to teach me not to do, which was listen very carefully to what the numbers were actually saying and wait for exactly the right moment to let them speak. Detective Renee Castellano met me at a coffee shop 2 towns over, choosing the location herself, and I understood why the moment she explained her approach. She was compact, precise, the kind of person who took notes in tight, economical handwriting while you were still finishing a sentence, and she listened to the entire account, the will reading, the notary's admission, the dining room table, the safety deposit box, without a single interruption, only pausing near the end to ask me, very carefully, whether I had told anyone in my family what I had found. When I told her no, she nodded like that was the correct answer, and then she told me something that reshaped the entire next month of my life. If I confronted my family now, on my own, with what I had, they would have every opportunity to destroy evidence, coordinate their story, or simply claim that Vivian had been of sound mind, and that I was a bitter granddaughter contesting a will out of jealousy. But if I let them believe I had accepted everything, if I let the estate sale and the account transfers keep moving forward exactly as they had been, Every single action they took from that point forward would become part of an active paper trail that a district attorney could actually use. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my professional or personal life, which was nothing, visibly, for 6 more weeks. I went to Sunday dinners at my parents' house and complimented Kayla's nursery paint colors. I let my mother mention the realtor's offer on Cedar Lane, without reacting. I sat across from Dennis at a barbecue in July and listened to him talk about a boat he was thinking of buying once the estate cleared probate, and I smiled and asked what kind. Every one of those evenings, I drove home afterward and called Detective Castellano or Priscilla Choi with whatever new detail had surfaced, a comment about which bank branch they were using to process the transfers, a mention of the closing date on the house sale, a slip from my mother about how relieved she was that Wade had gotten everything filed before. In her words, anyone could make a fuss about it. Priscilla filed a formal notice contesting probate quietly through the court, and Castellano opened a criminal investigation that ran parallel to it, subpoenaing the joint account records directly from the bank, records that confirmed everything Vivian's own highlighted statements had already shown me in that safety deposit box. The investigation moved faster than I expected, mostly because once Castellano's team pulled the bank's internal records, they found something even I hadn't anticipated: a series of text messages between my mother and Wade Pruitt discussing, in language that left very little room for alternate interpretation, how to structure the new will so that it would, in Wade's own words, hold up better than if we just cut her out completely. Wade, it turned out, was in deeper financial trouble than any of us knew, behind on his own mortgage after a bad year for his practice, and the messages showed a clear arrangement, a fee well beyond his usual rate in exchange for drafting a document he knew full well did not reflect Vivian's actual wishes, along with arranging the notary himself, once the credit union's own in-house notary, a woman who had known Vivian for 15 years, had apparently declined to travel to a private residence for the signing without a reason that satisfied her professional conscience. The confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon in November, not because I chose the date, but because Castellano's team, once they had enough for warrants, moved on their own timeline, and I was asked simply to be present at the district attorney's office when my mother and Wade were brought in separately for questioning, since I was, at that point, the estate's rightful heir and a material witness to nearly every piece of the case. I sat in a small waiting area outside the interview rooms, with Priscilla beside me, and through the thin wall, I could hear my mother's voice rise and fall in a rhythm I recognized instantly from 35 years of listening to her explain away things that didn't quite add up. The same warm, reasonable tone she had used my entire childhood to smooth over every uneven thing in our family. Except this time, there was no smoothing it, because Castellano had the bank records, the text messages, the notary's statement, and the medical documentation of impaired capacity laid out in a folder on the table between them, and reasonable warmth does not overturn a paper trail. I want to tell you what it felt like sitting in that hallway, because I think it matters more than the outcome itself. I had spent 35 years being the daughter who fixed things quietly and never asked for credit, and here I was again, quiet, patient, sitting in a hard plastic chair, while someone else's fate unfolded behind a closed door. Except this time the quiet wasn't submission, it was strategy, and the patience wasn't the patience of a girl waiting to be noticed, it was the patience of a woman who had learned, from the only person in her life who had ever truly seen her, that the truth doesn't need you to shout it, it only needs you to have kept it safe long enough for the right moment to arrive. When the door finally opened, and Castellano stepped out to tell me my mother had been placed under arrest, along with a separate warrant issued for Wade Pruitt, whose messages had implicated him even more directly than my mother's own words had, I did not feel the triumph I had once imagined I might feel in that moment. I felt something quieter than that, something closer to relief, the specific relief of a person who has spent her entire life being told the numbers didn't matter, finally watching the numbers do exactly what my grandmother always promised me they would do, if you were patient enough and honest enough to let them. The case took almost 8 months to fully resolve, and I want to walk you through what happened to everyone, because I think the consequences matter as much as the confrontation itself. My mother was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and forgery, and rather than face a trial where the bank records and Wade's own text messages would be read into evidence, she accepted a plea agreement that carried probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent record that ended her ability to serve as executor or fiduciary for anyone ever again. Wade Pruitt lost his license to practice law entirely, faced separate charges for his role in drafting and backdating the fraudulent will, and the last I heard, he had sold his office space to cover legal fees and moved out of state to live with a brother in Kentucky. The notary, Renata Ospina, cooperated fully with the investigation once she understood the scope of what she had unknowingly participated in, and in exchange for her honesty, she avoided criminal charges herself, though she surrendered her notary commission voluntarily before the state board could revoke it for her. Kayla's role in all of it turned out to be more complicated than I expected, and this is the part of the story I still think about the most. She had not known, at least not in the beginning, exactly how far my mother and Wade had gone, though she had certainly known enough to look away from the parts that made her uncomfortable. The vague sense that the timeline of the new will felt rushed, the way our mother had discouraged her from asking too many questions about it. When the truth came out fully in the DA's filing, Kayla called me, crying in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before. Not the composed, camera-ready crying she'd done at the funeral, but something rawer, and she told me she was sorry, that she had spent her whole life letting our parents hand her things without asking what it cost anyone else, and that she didn't expect me to forgive her, but she needed me to know she saw it now, clearly, for the first time. I told her I appreciated her calling, and that whatever relationship we rebuilt from here would have to be built slowly, on actual honesty, the way everything real gets built. And to my surprise, she agreed, and she has kept that agreement in the months since, showing up in small, consistent ways that feel nothing like the family currency I grew up watching, and everything like the plain, steady kind of care Vivian always tried to teach me was the only kind that actually meant something. The probate court ultimately recognized Priscilla's filing and the original, properly executed will, and Vivian's estate passed to me exactly as she had intended: the house on Cedar Lane, her remaining savings, and the small trust I hadn't even known existed until I opened that safety deposit box. I did not sell the house. I want to be clear about that, because I know some people expected me to, given everything that had happened. But that house was the only place in my entire childhood where I had ever felt fully, unconditionally chosen, and I was not about to hand it over to a realtor's sign in the yard. I moved in gradually over the following spring, keeping her kitchen table exactly where it had always sat, keeping the recipe tin on the shelf above the stove, though I finally moved the brass key it had once held into a small frame beside a photograph of the two of us from that science fair afternoon so many years earlier, the only two people who had shown up. I used a portion of the trust, the part I felt certain Vivian would have wanted spent this way, to establish a small scholarship through the community college where I once wished I could have taken a discounted summer course, a fund specifically for students studying accounting or finance who are working while they study, the kind of quiet, practical support nobody ever offered me but that I know, now, changes the entire shape of a young person's future when someone finally decides to offer it. I named it simply the Hargrove Fund, no mention of my own name attached to it, because I understood by then exactly what Vivian had been trying to teach me my whole life, that the truest kind of giving asks for nothing back, not even credit. My father, through all of this, said very little, the same way he had said very little through most of my childhood, though he did call me once, quietly, a few weeks after the plea agreements were finalized, and told me, in a voice that sounded older than I remembered it, that he had known something wasn't right about that first will the moment he heard it read aloud, and that he was ashamed of himself for staying quiet, simply because staying quiet had always been easier than asking hard questions in our family. I told him I understood, because I did, more than he probably realized, having spent 35 years being the person in that family who quietly noticed everything and said almost nothing about most of it. We talk more now, carefully, the way two people rebuild something that was never quite finished being built in the first place. I still sit at that kitchen table most Sunday afternoons, sometimes alone, sometimes with Kayla and her daughter, who is almost 2 now and who I am slowly teaching, the same way Vivian once taught me, how to count out coins into neat little stacks on the table, though I haven't gotten to the checkbook lessons yet. I think about that flash drive in my coat pocket sometimes, sitting on that hallway bench outside the district attorney's office, waiting to find out whether the truth I had spent months quietly assembling would finally be allowed to speak as loudly as it needed to. And I think about the last line of Vivian's letter, the one that still sits framed on my desk at work, where I can see it every single day I go into the office, to do exactly the kind of work she taught me to love. You always knew how to read what was true, even when it was quiet, Rose. Now go make sure the truth gets to speak as loudly as it needs to. That's what I did. That's what I will keep doing, for every client whose numbers don't quite add up, and for every quiet daughter out there who has ever been told that being easy to overlook meant she wasn't worth the investment. If this story reminded you of your own family's math, the kind that never quite added up in your favor, I want you to know it is never too late to learn how to read the numbers for yourself. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments whether you saw the ending coming, and if you're new here, subscribe, because there is always another quiet person out there finally ready to let the truth speak.